Well, good morning and a very warm welcome to this webinar this morning. Station Development, Delivering Station Regeneration, Anticipating Future Needs. My name is Jonathan Chatfield. I'm the Head of Station Policy at Rail Delivery Group, and I'm really grateful to Waterfront for having put on this webinar because things are not as they were, are they? Clearly, we're used to meeting physically for this kind of event, used to getting the networking and the other things that are an essential part of this sort of thing. But it's so important, even though we are in these different times, that we still carry on this sort of conversation. So I'm really grateful that Waterfront's pulled together a great set of speakers this morning for you. And I'm hoping that we're going to have this as a conversation, really. So we have 3 speakers who I'll give about 10 minutes to each of those. And then I really want to kind of encourage conversation and as many questions as we can. So those questions will come in to me after the speakers have made their opening remarks, and then we'll run 20 minutes or half an hour of questions, and we've got an hour for this up until 11 o'clock. So yeah, very grateful for you for joining. Just a couple of opening remarks from me. I mean, clearly these are very strange and different times, aren't they? I think the collaboration that I've seen in the work that we've done at RDG over the COVID-19 sort of recovery phase has been tremendous. I mean, collaboration across train operators, externally, and Network Rail as well. A really good sense of partnership and working together. And I think what this sort of webinar does, we can open that out as well to an external audience as well, to get that collaboration continuing. I mean, clearly, when you see the Prime Minister talking about public transport being not for travelling, only for essential workers, please use private cars, that seemed to feel very different to us, and it felt kind of wrong, really. But it was right for the time. And I think now what we're seeing with that change of messaging, with the attracting of people back to public transport in a safe way, and stations play a huge part in that, don't they? Stations give that confidence with the right cleaning regimes, the right staffing levels and all of that. They give the confidence that people need to return to the railway. And stations as well, and where this webinar I think will come to life, stations also will play such a huge role in the economic recovery that is going to be so essential as we come out of the lockdown phase and head back to some sort of normality. So the work we've been doing at RDG continues to focus on the customer at the centre, be that information, be that accessibility, active travel. Sustainability is going to be a key part. I think we'll be hearing about that this morning, I'm sure. The whole zero carbon future, that will not have gone away, and that will still be very uppermost in people's thoughts and our future planning. And then the whole future piece of innovation and technology, and how we in the railway kind of play our part in the changing trends and the changing modes and things as they develop. So I think there's a very bright future for the railway still, and for stations, and like stations as part of their community will still play a really vital role. But enough from me. You've not come here to hear me, you've come here to hear our 3 speakers. And I'm going to start with introducing our first speaker, who is Mahir Benison from Arup. Mahir's a senior planner there, got experience in architecture, engineering, project management. In fact, before joining Arup, worked for Network Rail, worked on the Waterloo station upgrade, amongst other things. So delighted that you're able to join us, and I'll hand over to Mahir now to take us forward for the next 5-10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Morning, everyone. Just waiting for the slides to catch up. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening with the slides, but So thank you for the introduction, Jonathan. I think I'll just get straight into the topic of my presentation. So I wanted to start with the reminder of Tomorrow's Living Station, which was launched last year in collaboration with Network Rail. And this really highlights the three principles that we believe are important for planning the future station, and that is stations as the centre of movement for people, stations as supporting inclusive growth, and stations as the heart of healthy communities. And moving on to the next slide, will it work? Sorry about this. There we go. Oh, I've gone too far now. That's better. And this is the drawing that's referenced throughout the entire document, and it is actually one of my favorite drawings because it's really hard to actually see where the station is, and it represents the blurring of boundaries between the city and the station itself. And I think this is a really important principle that will carry forward into planning the future station, that blending of boundaries. I don't think, as Jonathan said, we can go very far without reflecting on the current situation. I think we have already experienced demand implications and in turn revenue implications for the rail industry, and also that's impacted stations. And it's kind of propelled us into this world of potential uncertainty over how we might plan stations, and there is a question over what metrics we might use to kind of prioritize investment at our stations. There are underlying transport trends, prior to COVID, and we need to sort of think about these, and these were kind of tending towards on-demand travel, focusing on healthy environments, healthy streets and public realm, and just the ease and convenience to drive that customer experience. But then there were also some underlying behavioral trends, some of which have become even more prominent during lockdown. The focus on active travel, working from home, which could continue beyond as lockdown eases, but also the rediscovery of our local place and the pride and importance we feel about it. But in terms of refocusing the attention back to stations specifically, I think the key priorities going forwards are going to be around resilience, and splitting that resilience down into three key areas. I think it's going to be operational resilience, thinking about the different modes that a station might need to operate within; business resilience, thinking about alternative forms of revenue that a station might bring in; and climate resilience, the obvious need to tackle zero net carbon. I wanted to show you this video, which I hope will play, which shows how spaces in a station might have to adapt in the future. And so this is a mass motion model which shows normal operations versus socially distanced operations, and you can see that there's a difference in the kind of spatial requirements, but also that there are longer alighting and boarding times of trains, and this will have an impact on the physical design of stations themselves. There we go. So in terms of physical design, I think there is going to be a need to focus on flexibility to operate the different operational modes, as I said, but also thinking about permeability to allow stations to flex into their surrounding urban environment if they need to. And also thinking about natural ventilation for the health of our passengers, and bringing in some greenery and potentially garden spaces within our stations. There's also a digital layer to consider, and technology will play a role in easing passenger journeys through the stations themselves, reducing the number of touch points potentially, and creating that efficiency. So things like staged boarding, seat allocation, digital ticketing, I think this is all going to become quite important as we move forwards. But also there's benefits to retail too, where passengers will be able to pre-order snacks and coffees before they arrive at the station, saving time. Thinking about the business resilience point, as I mentioned, demand changes have had a revenue impact at stations. The traffic through our stations has fallen for the time being, and we don't know how that's going to recover. And I wanted to draw some parallels with our high streets and town centres, which have been struggling for a while, and the current situation has hit them hard. And I wonder whether there are synergies that we can draw between the two so that they can both recover healthily together. And the government is investing in various schemes and funding pots through various funding pots. So Future High Streets Fund, Stronger Towns Fund, Restoring Your Railways. I think there's a really key connection we can make between these and combine investment so that we get a much better outcome. But we also should think about how we are going to use the railway. Are we going to use railways in the peaks like we did before? Because that's what we essentially were planning for. But the peaks may not be the same, and actually, could some of that investment be diverted towards making our station spaces better? And then thinking about diversification of revenue, can we capitalize on this decentralization that we're experiencing? People working from home more, rediscovering their local spaces, thinking about the idea of the polycentric city. We could start to introduce more community-focused uses at stations and potentially address inequality. So, providing office spaces for those that don't have the ability to work at home, or learning hubs, or potentially even other local community services and affordable housing. There's obviously a need to plan for zero net carbon. I wanted to highlight Birmingham Interchange Station, which became the first station globally to achieve BREEAM Outstanding for a number of features that it has integrated into its design and construction and operation. But we need to this can't be the exception to the rule. It really needs to become the norm and the basic standard. And we also should consider stations in their context. Many of our stations may not be conducive to supporting low carbon living. If we take the example of parkway stations, vast amounts of parking, they might have been suitable in the decades prior to now, where fuel prices were cheap and everyone had their own car. But are these really going to be suitable going forwards? And we should really think about creating integrated phased master plans that take us to building sustainable communities around some of these stations. And then finally, thinking about local connectivity and how people get to and from their stations. And I think the emphasis on planning forecourts to drive modal shift will become very important. So how do we promote the use of public transport, active travel, and make it attractive so that's the first thing you see when you leave your station entrance? And there needs to be a integration with the digital realm as well. So how can we create that seamless interchange? And stations need to facilitate that infrastructure and plan that infrastructure into their building fabric to make sure that this technology can be exploited. So then in summary, I've basically covered the point that I wanted to make, which was we need to plan for resilience, operational, business, and climate, whilst not also forgetting the principles of tomorrow's living station. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Mahir. I think that's set us off really well. I think, focusing on that resilience and I liked in particular the way you weaved in the economic, the social and the environmental aspects of stations, because I think it's very important to see stations in that wider context. Thank you. Without further ado, we'll hand next to Anna Keaton. Anna is a partner at Adamshaw Goddard, joint head there of the transport sector team, and a lot of experience of station-led regeneration schemes and development partnerships. So you're very welcome. We'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Mahir. I think that was fascinating, and apologies if this doesn't quite come up to the breadth of that wonderful presentation. So yes, I'm a transport lawyer and also a real estate lawyer. So I guess I I focus on this from a background of many years working in the development and regeneration space, but also looking at how we can finance development projects and how we can incorporate infrastructure and private sector involvement in those projects. So for me, station regeneration has to be about regeneration and not just development or construction. There's a huge amount of focus at the moment on new infrastructure, and I think we'd all welcome that. But if we forget that place and that essential built environment element of what we're producing, then we will not realise the value of what we need to do. I agree with a lot of what Mahir had said around the totality of what we need to appreciate when approaching these projects. I've also got three things. I think you have to have three things in presentations like this, but my first one would be that placemaking element. These projects take, in their nuts and bolts level, away from the wonderful pictures that we see from architects. They take a huge amount of time to come to fruition. During that time, local populations can become quite frustrated. Developers and investors becoming involved in those projects can feel like they can't see long-term viability. So ensuring that we make quick decisions about what that placemaking role is and what that station is going to do in that community is absolutely essential. And in doing that, we need to drive those value creation opportunities and ensure the right passenger experience, because ultimately it will only work if the passengers and the customers are seeing a flexible space that is part of their community. I think from my perspective, looking at the investment potential of different uses of land in stations and around stations is absolutely critical. And Mahir's right that COVID has changed a lot of that, and I'll come on to talk to that in a second. And thirdly, that connectivity piece. So yes, it's not just about how we integrate technically all the different transport modes to the station, but also digital and also freight and logistics. Personally, I think that the integration of how we look at last mile delivery, how we look at using stations as those often critically centred locations in our towns and cities to then be used to deliver logistics in a much more carbon neutral and more logical way would be a really big win out of new station projects in the future. So yes, achieving those aims has got a whole lot more complicated as of late. I think looking at the example of John Lewis in Birmingham, often at these conferences over the years, we've talked about the example of Grand Central and what a wonderful opportunity we had with our stations to effectively create new shopping centres. That now is facing a real challenge. I remember just last year I was talking to the head of research at a leading pension fund, who essentially said to me they weren't hugely keen on retail anymore, but that what they were really keen on was retail in stations. I'm not sure they'll have the same view anymore, and that's a real shame in some ways, but it also is an opportunity to look at different uses and to be a bit more imaginative about how we're using our stations rather than just seeing them as an extension of a city centre that in most cases is already well served by retail. The other side of that Jonathan talked about is the loss of passengers and that fare revenue. We don't have that inevitable assumption anymore of increases in passenger numbers that will just keep coming and coming and coming and always be at those peak times. People are going to work in different ways. We don't know how different new normal will be, but we need to plan for that flexibility and engage that imagination in how we ensure that we're using the footfall in the right way. So that loss of income and the greater uncertainty in the next few years will make it more difficult for private sector involvement. But I think the need for private sector involvement will only become greater. We're perhaps getting used to at the moment the government signing lots of big cheques. That won't be a panacea, that won't continue. Many local authorities in particular that want to sponsor these kind of projects are really suffering now. We need to build on the progress that have already been made with the Open for Business agenda that Network Rail's put forward. Make sure that we're creating viable station regeneration opportunities that can involve the private sector, which will largely involve making changes to ensure we can deliver quicker. And yes, the projects that are brought forward will have to be sustainable and will have to meet the decarbonisation agenda. So in terms of the uses of stations, I think, again, I agree with some of what Mahir said, and none of us have a crystal ball, but I think it's about looking at what will drive the most value. So for me, something like build to rent on adjacent land, so residential build for rent and for affordable housing is a real opportunity, and something that you're already seeing people like Granger take advantage of. Co-working spaces, there will be demand for that. Healthcare, and then coming back to that logistics and freight issues, looking to integrate perhaps consolidation centres within stations, thinking about integrated links with freight lines and with ports. Ports are likely to see greater value in international travel and putting containers onto rail in the future. If we can integrate that and make sure that we're delivering a solution that takes cars and vans off the road, with everybody wanting so much more online delivery, that would be a real win. Data is essential. Smart ticketing offers a huge number of possibilities around capturing that as a commercial opportunity. And I think from the point of view of sustainability, it isn't just about designing stations that are sustainable, but also thinking about how you drive value from that. There's a lot of impetus at the moment to find those shovel-ready green projects. They might involve incorporating alternative energy uses in station, or thinking about how you add on energy efficient products, which then can be monetized. So charging infrastructure would be an example of that. And there are lots of policy reasons to suggest that there will be more station opportunities going forward, notwithstanding the difficult environment. We know that there's a huge commitment from central government at the moment to infrastructure projects, HS2, MPR. We've got the Northern Transport Acceleration Council announcement this morning. It looks like the direction of travel will be a greater amount of funding, but directed at those key infrastructure projects, which can also talk to levelling up and improving connectivity to those underperforming areas. The Williams Review may never see the light of day in its current form, but the reorganisation of franchises should mean that we've got an opportunity to think about how we build in station improvement as well as station development that is building towards achieving those aims and those long-term investment goals rather than just short-term maintenance. Local authorities are not backing down from their regeneration programmes. We've spent lockdown talking to a huge number of local authorities in a series of roundtables, and it's clear that their infrastructure projects and their regeneration projects remain at the heart of what they want to do, notwithstanding reduced funding. And if local authorities can sponsor station projects and incorporate those in their master plans, then that too should be an opportunity for others. I think ensuring in all of that that we meet the putting passengers first agenda, and that also the central government deliver on their promises to make the nuts and bolts of delivery, so the planning process, the procurement process, the consenting process, more straightforward. We've been talking about that again at every single one of these conferences I've ever attended. It sounds like we might now get somewhere on that. Certainly if you look at what they've done in housing in the last couple of days, there does seem to be a real commitment to reduce red tape. Clearly we need to do that in a safe way, and we'd all be committed to that. So in summary, I think there is still a huge opportunity. It has got more complicated, but in some ways that will just cause us to be more honest and more true to finding the right solution, not the cheapest solution or necessarily the quickest solution, but something that's right for every place and that delivers to the needs of that place and the needs of the passengers who are using that station. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Anna, and I think really important the focus you go there on funding and finance as well, because it's all very well as having these great ideas about stations, but if we can't actually bring together that private and public sector in terms in particular with the planning and of financing, then they just remain ideas. So I think really important to think about, and I liked as well your reference to last mile logistics and whether we can maybe rethink the way in which we use our station space necessarily in a new way, because that did happen in the past as well. But I think there's definitely a moving forward on that we can rethink and give more of a focus to that as well. I think we use our station space. But yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for that. Our final speaker, before we open up to questions, and if I can just encourage you to be asking your questions as we go along. You can pose your questions and post them in to us. Then we've obviously got those ready and waiting at the end of the three speakers. So feel free to pose your questions as we go along. Our third and final speaker this morning is Dave Darnell. Dave is a transport consultant at WSP, has had many years experience there, particularly on the station side of things, has worked on a number of very large rail projects, including HS2, Thameslink and Crossrail, and got a significant experience on station regeneration and station projects. So Dave, we'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right. Waiting for a slot sit. Okay. The advantages and disadvantages of being last in giving presentations, because you find that quite a lot of what you want to talk about has already been mentioned. But hopefully you will realise that the presentations are intended to stimulate discussion. As already has been mentioned, life has changed and our working practices have changed due to the pandemic. Whether temporarily or permanently, it's too early to say. Certainly since I retired from full-time position with WSP, life has moved on, and the designs of stations need to take account of not only the impact of pandemic, but also climate change. And in my role with the ICE, we're certainly looking at how issues affect the Southeast in particular. I'd just like to take a step back 2 years to 2018. Just a few statistics here, where the UN identified globally that 55% of the world's population lived in urban areas, compared with 30% in 1950. And in Europe, 74%. At the time, it was expected that this would increase, and the move was looking to develop within the urban areas, and certainly we're looking at transport-oriented development, and obviously focused around the stations. But of course, things have changed, and we've had the pandemic, and it's demonstrated that people are able to work from home. Online shopping has accelerated. All these have been mentioned already, and it raises a number of questions about the demand for office space, demand for high street retail. Mentioned that the city centres are declining, but why move all this retail into stations? Is there demand for that? And do people need to be closer to the urban centres, or is there a move to actually decentralise and move out where perhaps properties are cheaper? People might believe there's a better quality of life. I certainly live out in a rural location, and as consequences, a reduced need to travel. The impacts or potential impacts on station enhancements, as mentioned, reduction in private sector development investment. Developing around stations is costly, so there's got to be a demand for it. Public transport health risk, we've talked about that, and it's a concern that people perhaps will revert to the use of private transport. Whether that will change, that's up to people to provide the confidence to start travelling again on public transport. And as a consequence, there's a reduction in footfall. So really, whereas 2 years ago, people were looking to take property around stations because of the footfall, this may very well have reduced. And of course, there's going to be limited public sector funds available. The government are funding an awful lot at the moment, and you've got to look at stations and will the money be available? So we've got the challenges, public confidence to use the public transport. We've got to think about attracting investment, think differently. And the big thing for me is that public-private sector collaboration. We've got to be, as an industry, I'm an engineer, not a transport person, as per se, more transport infrastructure, but we've got to think differently. In the collaboration, we've got to compromise. Just move on. Just looking at TOD, there's two bits for TOD. One is where you haven't got the existing connectivity, so I'll put that to one side. And you look at the stations themselves, and there's always been an attraction around there because the infrastructure exists. And so you're looking at oversight development or adjacent site development. But I think it's already been mentioned, it's got to be more than that. You've got to look at the urban realm and the improvements that can be made to make it a more attractive place to be. Certainly the work that we did on Euston in the early stages, where in conjunction with Wilkinson Air, we produced a master plan, and that had quite a good balance there. But you've got to get a balance on these stations between the oversight development and bringing in that funding, the finance and revenue, to making them open area spaces where people want to be. You've got to look at the potential for renewable energy, photovoltaic cells on roofs and things like that. There's a balance to be reached there. And you can't have everything. Unfortunately, people do. So that's where the compromise has to come. And that's just looking here. You've got to add value. There's got to be a balance between, obviously, the cost is expensive. You've got to add value. So we've got to be innovative in how we design. But people's expectations have got to be realistic, and that is the public sector and the private sector. That discussion needs to take place early on. Anna has mentioned the time it takes to progress these decisions, but within WSP, and particularly in the US, they've actually contracted that approach by making it far more collaborative at an early stage. Some people may have heard of Hudson Yards, where we were heavily involved in actually bringing those decisions together. And so you didn't go too far down the line before you identified that something wasn't feasible or even viable. So that decision to progress has got to be a lot quicker. We produced a paper on this, bit of publicity there. This paper is available. I'll skip through that. If you want it, contact me. Stations of the future. And Mahir has gone through this. I'm probably repeating a lot of what he has said. Key functions. The station has to be multifunctional. It's a community hub. Not just the major stations, but smaller stations can be centres. They can have anything from a post office to a news agent. They've got to be welcoming places. The station might be the secondary function these days, being a railway station. Got to be accessible. We all know about that. But it's not just step-free. It's got to have the facilities where people can access ticket machines quite easily. State-of-the-art communications. Everything has got to be linked. But we've got to use the smartphones more cleverly. I'm fed up with bumping into people who are looking down at their phone, looking to see where to go. It should be linked to audio. It should be linked to visual signs on stations, and all things should be linked together. And that's the way to be going. Coordination, and then obviously sustainability. Whether we've taken the COVID has taken the move for net zero carbon backwards slightly, people wanting to have the safety of their own cars, we'll have to wait and see. But we've got to reduce the need for energy by bringing in natural light to the stations. Mahir's touched on this, so I won't go into it. use of renewable energy, and even waste management. Around stations, the station retail is producing a lot of waste. How we deal with that. And just to wrap up, I blitzed through this fairly quickly. A fact coming out of the ICE's paper on sustainability in transport, the recent one, in 2050, 85% of infrastructure has already been built today. So we have got to get our crystal balls out and be looking to the future to see what people are going to be wanting in 2050, because the HS2s and projects like that, we've got to be thinking, what is the future? It's no good designing for what people want today. We've got to be thinking about tomorrow. Thank you.
That's great, Dave. Thank you very much indeed. And even though you were the third of three, I think you added some new insights there, very definitely. I particularly liked the kind of focus on adding value, and also about collaborating early. I think we often leave collaboration too late in the process, and the comments you made there about bringing collaboration much earlier in the process of any sort of station regeneration, I think is a really helpful insight as well. Thank you. So we're going to open it up now to more of a conversation. So do please keep asking your questions, which I'll be posing to the panelists, and the panel will be coming back now to kind of comment on questions as we go through. I wonder if I might sort of take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question, if I may. Clearly, Boris Johnson doing a lot of talk about big infrastructure schemes and investing in infrastructure coming out of COVID. I mean, should our focus be on central government in particular, or should we be focusing more on devolved administrations, thinking of Scotland, thinking of Wales, thinking of subnational transport bodies and the whole kind of devolution agenda and their keenness and willingness to get involved in station schemes? I mean, you may well answer just it's both, it's national as well as devolved, but what's your thoughts around where we should be maybe targeting central as opposed to devolved administrations? I don't know who wants to kick off on that one.
I could kick off. So, I mean, I think this goes back to my point about thinking about the decentralized economy and the idea of a polycentric city. And I think that that sort of knowledge is probably going to exist more at the local level. And so channeling that investment through devolved organizations is probably going to make more sense than thinking about that at the national level. I think that the focus has tended to be on the bigger infrastructure projects, and so some of the smaller station projects may have suffered. And I think there are some really nice initiatives happening now, like the recently launched Network Rail competition, looking at the smaller scaled stations, and really trying to think about what do these stations, which are sometimes quite forgotten, and what do they need to do and what do they need to become. And I think that shift of focus is probably what makes me think that actually the devolved route for the time being is probably the right approach.
My colleagues look at the railway as vertical and horizontal. They look at the stations as the vertical bit of it, and I think the vertical part, which is stations, I think can be devolved, because my view is that a station can be part of a community, whether it is in London, for Euston, for instance, and certainly the work we did, and certainly Arab have been involved and are involved now on Euston, we're totally involved on it. But at Camden, we're heavily involved in producing a master plan, and that's where the collaboration has got to happen. But it can happen at a smaller scale in small rural stations, I think. So I think, yes, to answer the question, I think the responsibility for stations should be devolved.
My view on that is that should be instigated is hopefully what might be coming out of the National Transport Acceleration Council developments that have been announced today. So if we can get quicker central government decisions that then enable local leaders and devolved authorities to do what they want to do, then that would be a great step forward, and hopefully that will help to accelerate projects. I think that where we see strong local leadership, we do see identification of problems, and ultimately that local accountability through the democratic structure does seem to work. I'm from the northeast, and seeing what's happening in places like Middlesbrough and Darlington as a result of strong political lobbying and relationships to improve those stations is really great, because it's been a long time coming, and I think it's perhaps we're at a moment now where central government is listening to those places that haven't had the big investments in the past, and hopefully that does help to move things along, because we've got some fantastic local leaders and a huge amount of skill in local government to drive those projects on a sort of locally appropriate level.
Great, thank you. We've got a question about sort of the requirements for these particular kind of station regeneration schemes. You know, what are the mechanics and the ways in which people actually get to find out what it is that's being asked for? You know, is this a formal sort of procurement process, or I wonder if maybe this is an opportunity to talk a bit more about that kind of collaboration early on around how you actually develop the requirements for a particular project. Master planning was talked about as well, but what are your thoughts around how those kind of things emerge and the way that people get to find out, you know, what it is that the requirements of these projects?
I mean, the requirement, I mean, in actually delivering these stations, there is a set schedule of requirements, and that has developed through the various planning processes. You take the larger projects through HS2 and the stations there, through the parliamentary process, undertakings and assurances were given, which are part of the requirements. So there's a commitment being given. Certainly on Crossrail was the same. In delivering Bond Street Station, we had to satisfy the requirements, and those are promises effectively made through the Parliamentary Act. And at a local level, that comes through planning. I mean, obviously, Network Rail and Anna on the legal side will probably know a little bit more than I do. Well, I do know that they have permitted development rights, but some stations have to go through planning. And even on HS2, there are the planning authorities have some responsibilities for stating what they'll accept and what they won't accept. And those requirements develop as the project develops. My biggest gripe as a deliverer is that we don't pull the shutters down on those requirements early enough, and they keep changing and added to, and we're surprised that the cost goes up. And this is where, you know, the value has got to be looked at. You're looking to say, right, well, this is our budget, and we'll keep to that. There's no surprise when you start adding more requirements in when the cost goes up and exceeds the budget. And so the requirements, to answer your question, Jonathan, they develop over the whole design cycle. But I believe we've got to pull a shutter down at some stage to avoid increased costs.
So to add to that, I think it's about sort of getting that holistic view from the start. And I think there are examples of this happening. So organizations like the Victoria Bid, who are leading the Victoria Station regeneration, and I think getting those requirements from all parties in early and understanding their governance processes and how sort of quite complex funding and financing arrangements might come together, I think is an important consideration for these requirements. And I believe that, I mean, I've worked on a couple of these, but sort of creating joint development briefs, I think, is a really good way of doing this, that that include sort of the rail component, but also the kind of wider master plan component. And I think that really does need to draw all of those things together in a formal document.
Personally, I think the route devolution within Network Rail has helped. I think having greater accountability of those regions and knowing who's responsible for bringing forward those projects. I think we've come past that problem of that front door issue that we've always had in terms of who's actually going to be making the decision. On the consultation front, yes, there are the legal procedures, but I think the best projects take their local communities along that consultation journey in a much wider way. I think, yes, Victoria is a great example of that. Also, I currently live in York, and I think the York Central consultation has been over a number of years and has really tried to break down that public perception of what that scheme could be and try and bring the imagination to life a little bit, but not in a way that has a big master plan drawing with a very expansive, shiny golden roof that then everyone thinks, will that ever be delivered? And then it doesn't ever match up to what actually gets delivered 10 years later. So it is about being realistic and absolutely bringing together all interested parties and stakeholders regularly to iron out problems. And we can do that. We can set up structures from a legal perspective as well as from a technical perspective that help to flush out those problems earlier. And I think it's all about that project management and having a very, very clear vision of what you want from a particular station, but allowing a degree of flexibility so that it doesn't fall over at the first problem.
Thank you. There's a question just come in on smaller stations. Those that are familiar with categorization A to F, the smaller stations, the kind of D, E, F, where you go down to the unstaffed stations, but also maybe think about B, C, D, the kind of mid-size. A lot of you are focused at the moment on the big stations, and often that gets the focus. But maybe I can start with you, Anna, maybe thinking from sort of funding and financing perspective. Are we only really talking about the big stations for those kind of schemes, or what is it we could do to bring about regeneration amongst the sort of medium size and smaller stations as well? Any thoughts?
So it's absolutely not just the big station projects. There are a huge number of new stations that are being talked about. There's also small works that can add a huge amount of value to a station in terms of seating or accessibility, or looking at how car parking can be reconfigured. A lot of very successful short-term station development projects essentially involve thinking about a more imaginative parking solution or something that integrates more public transport as you reach that station, and then using that land for something more valuable. It doesn't have to be a Euston, even though I hope that project is hugely successful, but it can be something as simple as what is there a demand for that land? How can we release value, and how can then we make the best decisions about how we spend that money on the right improvements for that community? And I think that again is all about collaboration, making sure that the planning authorities are on board with what's happening and what the plans are. But yeah, I mean, I think a small parkway station can make a huge difference. There's several coming through in West Yorkshire at the moment that will properly unlock areas of around Leeds that have basically just been trapped between motorways previously. So the impact of small stations can be massive as well.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from other panelists on smaller stations?
Yes, I mean, I've talked about Euston, and my involvement has been on large stations. I have had some involvement in small ones, but on a personal nature, I live down in the New Forest. My local station is Brockenhurst, and there's a community group there, Friends of Brockenhurst Station, which I'm part of. And there are volunteers there that, in conjunction with the train operating company, we do work on the station and to enhance it. Very simple stuff, but there's volunteer groups, and if there's a flexibility around to encourage these volunteer groups, the people are only too pleased to help and to try and do something. You take it up a step. Obviously, local authorities. But there's a small shop on the station as well, and you know, it's about the community, and I think that you've got to take the community along with you on these smaller stations as well. But the train operating companies have a role to play in all of this, and we've got to make sure that Network Rail, as the infrastructure owner, are flexible in their approach as well, and you don't get what I would call the Railway Annex Act blocking things, which really it's this computer says no, we can't do that. You can do anything if you try and put your mind to it.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. Do keep questions coming in. Can I ask a question about costs in particular? Sort of how do we, with these kind of schemes, prevent costs from escalating, running away with themselves? How do we incentivize the players in the right way? Big question, I know, but just a few thoughts on kind of the costs of these projects and the right kind of budgeting and program and governance. Maybe start with Mahir and then Anna.
I think risk management is key for this, so making sure that risks are identified and, you know, the right sorts of budgets are placed in a contingency pot to make sure that, you know, those sorts of costs are covered. I think the uncertainty kind of stems from, you know, at the moment we're in a big pool of uncertainty, really. We don't know what's going to happen with construction costs going forwards, and so I think doing that risk management is going to be quite critical. I wonder whether this also then prevents us from looking at a lot of novel construction technologies within the station environment, and it makes us sort of stick to kind of safe, tried and tested bricks and mortar approaches. And I think looking at sort of modern methods of construction might be a way of trying to get some more cost certainty potentially around, you know, how we build these stations out and adapt them. So that's kind of my view on it.
I think my view is that the best way to control costs is to control time. If you can plan your project from the beginning and have that governance mechanism, that means that you know what you need to get sign off on from who when, and you've got the right people around the table from the beginning, then whilst obviously bringing in contingencies and troubleshooting mechanisms to get things resolved quickly, you can have a much greater degree of speed. And I mean, we'll see whether project speed works, but if we can find ways of delivering projects with greater certainty and with less red tape, whatever really that means, I suppose, in terms of which bits you want to get rid of, which will be the difficult decision in that. I do think you then can control costs, but obviously that's absolutely critical for bringing funders on board. And part of the time problem can often be the delay in getting funding sorted, because the funders don't know what the timescale is and therefore don't know what the costs are and therefore won't commit to funding. So it all interrelates, and the more that you can have a plan, it doesn't need to be incredibly complicated, but it needs to be decided upon and it needs to be flexible, and then work to that plan, the better.
I think we've touched on some of this already, which relates to requirements and changing the scope partway through perhaps the later stages of a project. I think the collaboration early on is very important. All the stakeholders need to sign up for it. They need to be realistic with their expectations. You need to set the budget and stick to it. I think that, as Mahir says, you look at the risks, and there are certainly, when I carry out design reviews, I focus on what the major risks are, ones that are going to affect cost. And not that we have a lot of control sometimes, because it comes down to expenditure, but I think that there are a number of aspects. I would start off with the requirements and you fix those. You would get them agreed by all stakeholders. You then look at the risks. you then to see how you can mitigate those risks and take those away from a contractor. You can't, as a client, go and stick an unknown risk onto a contractor without the contractor putting costs against it. You know, and clients have got to be realistic. There's got to be a sharing of where the risk is. So I could go on quite a lot about this because I've experienced it on London Bridge, Crossrail. Unfortunately, I can see the same thing happening on HS2. I just think that you need to sort of tie things down early on and stick to a budget and not keep adding to it, because you add things on during construction, it costs you 2 or 3 times more than it would do from the beginning.
Okay, thank you. We're nearly out of time, so I'm going to ask one more question, make this the last one, and if I can ask you to keep your answers very short. I mean, the second half of this was about anticipating future needs. Really just a question about active travel and integrated travel and where stations play within that. I mean, for example, is the day of the car park over? Do we want to just, when we're thinking about new stations, not think about car parks? Is it all about cycling? Is it about electric vehicles? You know, what's the future of this kind of integrated transport aspect of anticipating future needs? Very short answers, please.
So I think it's all about context. So it depends where the station is, the communities they're serving, and what the best response is. If you're in a dense urban environment, then stations should provide cycle parking and sort of more active travel, well, micro travel as well, options like electric scooter hire and things like that. But obviously, if you are in a more rural location, you may need to provide some parking, and that may need to be phased out over time as new options become available.
Thank you. Dave, any thoughts?
The park in a rural location, I live in a rural location. I think, you know, things like electric cars are going to be a thing of the future. Maybe the hire of small cars that you can just hire at a station. Yes, I think Mahir has probably covered a lot of it in his presentation, really. We've just got to be innovative. We've got to think, well, about next week or even next year, you know, in terms of context. Where are we going to be? And we've got to be creative on that.
Anna, last thought to you.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that, and I think electric vehicles and automated vehicles will be a big part of the solution. But I think also we need to think simple. So opening up places for people to walk and opening up places for people to safely cycle. You know, the sale of bikes during the pandemic has been through the roof. People love it. It's not, you know, I'm sure they'll get used to cycling in the rain when it comes to the autumn. But personally, you know, cycling with my family, I want to feel safe, and at the moment in most urban environments it's really difficult to do that. So let's get that right, and that seems like a cheap and easy way of getting more people to stations.
That's great, thank you. And I'm sure this conversation will carry on, the issues that have been raised this morning. Can I just extend my thanks to Waterfront and also to Mahir, to Anna and to Dave for your contributions this morning. Thank you to everyone else for joining. There will be an email coming out with links to this. I think this has been recorded this morning, so there will be an opportunity for you to look back at this or to share it with others. But yeah, thank you very much for contributions from our speakers and from all of you, all of your questions. And the debate will go on, and I'm sure we will be hopefully meeting physically as well as online in the future. But thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.